That's right. Listen, every country that's battling the coronavirus is dealing with an economic crisis of historic proportions. Indeed, the OBR, which is the government's budgetary watchdog, described it as the largest peacetime shock to the global economy on record. But in a pretty withering review of the government which it serves, it also pointed out that in the UK, it's worse than others in Europe because of Boris Johnson's decision to lock down later than other countries, prompted the need for a longer lockdown than elsewhere in Europe too. So at 11.3%, that's the forecast for the economic shrinkage this year. It will be the greatest since the Great Frost of 1709. And while the prospects for a strong bounce back are pretty good for next year, assuming that all the vaccines work as we all hope they do, there is this risk of what they call permanent scarring to the economy by the impact of the pandemic. The OBR saying that by 2025, the economy is now forecast to be 3% smaller than it would have been had it not been for the pandemic.
Rishi Sunak also announced a public sector pay freeze, a temporary suspension on overseas aid, as well as plans to borrow some 400 billion euros. How is he going to balance this without breaking the government's promise not to introduce austerity measures?
Well, listen, we all know austerity is a pretty toxic word here. It was the byword of the Cameron era, the post-financial crisis era. Many say that his tough approach on public spending brought about the conditions that gave us Brexit. You know, it was certainly something which Boris Johnson pledged in his election campaign last year to never countenance ever again. But back in December, we hadn't even heard, of course, of coronavirus. And of course, we've all seen the economic conditions which have followed. He won't want to use that word in connection of what we've been talking about today. But of course, any freeze of public wages, any rise in taxes is austerity. But, you know, given the circumstances, I don't think anybody is holding Boris Johnson to his election pledges on that from last December.
Well, the Chancellor did make it clear that he didn't expect the economy to pick up significantly for another 2 years. Tell us, how is Brexit going to play into all of this?
Well, it's a very good question. Obviously, nobody chose to go into a pandemic, but Brexit is something which this government certainly chose to go through. We still don't know what variety of Brexit we're talking about, whether there will be a deal or no deal. But recently, the Chancellor was speaking, and he continued to insist that no deal was a reasonably good outcome. But the Chancellor also said that the impact of the pandemic would be much worse than any adverse impacts of Brexit next year. But the Governor of the Bank of England, the central bank here, disagrees, and he said that no deal will be far worse than the impact of COVID, and of course it would compound the impact of COVID too. But listen, you know, most people with whom I speak are still quietly confident that no deal will be avoided, but of course until it's actually locked in and agreed with the clock ticking towards that deadline, you never can be sure.